Isn't it good to be listed? I mean, if you're not on Kospi, what the hell's happening? You know? Why doesn't he want to be listed anymore on the Dow? Or are they on NASDAQ? Yeah.
You're not allowed to experiment with something like innovative dilemma where you're listening to some numbers and charts that your own ideas.
Oh man, you're getting ahead of me, man. This is Clay Christian's Innovative Dilemma. All right. So we'll wait next week for more specifics on Clay. I mean, being listed, you know, it's so good because you get source of revenue. I mean, you all know that, you know, equity, you know. But then if you're listed, really you have a big headache is you have to satisfy these analysts. J.P. Morgan writes an article about Dell, you know, and if they do cite something bad, stock price goes down. And so they say, rough estimate, 30 to 40% of CEO's time is used meeting analysts, having lunch with analysts, you know, advertising their firm, saying we're good, we're doing well, and satisfying their fears. And so that's such a waste of time, according to Michael Dell. You know, I can use that time to have meetings with my managers to achieve sustained competitive advantage of Dell. What business should we go into, as the second group, you know, talked about in terms of the future. But I can't because I don't have the time. I have to satisfy these analysts because we're listed. And so if we're not listed anymore, it's not public anymore. And so there's a bad side. It's going to be very difficult to raise equity now. But you know, he's willing to take that chance, and he's thinking that Dell is in such bad shape, in such dire straits, as you say, that he needs to take this chance. And that's what this article last year is. So let me go over Dell in terms of the industry 5 forces. And again, both groups, I think, did a very good job. But it differs a little bit. So let me just go over very briefly. This is a 1983 Time. They had, usually it's Man of the Year, right? Everybody knows Time's cover. This year, 1983, it was Machine of the Year. And this was the PC, as everybody knows. And this is the evolution of the PC, which everybody knows from the article and the case. Now, the question I asked you was, how attractive is the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s? Again, this is such an important question for so many reasons. First of all, if you are a manager in an industry, you gotta know if the industry is attractive or not. You gotta know that to do any kind of strategy. And you're thinking of going into a new industry. Well, the first criteria you ask is, will it make any money? It is such an important question. Then everybody knows this. The question is, how do you know if an industry is attractive or not, or new business is good or not? And there are many ways. You can calculate the net present value and all these things. That's great. But now the best and most comprehensive is Michael Ford's 5 forces. And then I wanted you to, not only as a group, but individually as you read this case, I wanted to not use outside information, because there are a lot of outside information that have analyzed this in terms of computer industry and various industries. So if you read all that, then you can't think. And so I wanted you to just hold off a little bit, that temptation, and try to do it by yourself. And then you can share information after you've done that. So anyways, this is how you do it, as everybody knows, using Michael Ford's 5 forces. And the first question is threat of new entrants. In terms of the threat of new entrants, Hyunjin, what do you think? Threat of new entrants? Do you think the threat of new entrants in the PC industry in the mid-1990s is high or low or medium?
She need a mic.
No? Medium? Okay. Now you know I'm going to ask. Why? Sorry. Somebody's calling me. I think it's my wife.
There were a lot of companies entering that market.
that would make the threat very high if there are a lot of companies entering this market, right? And you're true. It's true that many companies did enter. It says in the case, low cost, white box manufacturers, and so on and so forth. You know, Korean companies, I'm sure at the time. Let's go with the sheet. 번역. Hey, what do you think, man? Threat of new entry. A little louder, please. The threat is high.
Yes.
Why?
There are IBM and other many other computer companies.
That makes, if there was IBM or other computer companies, that would lead to, what would that lead to?
Competitor.
More rivalry, I guess. That would be the fifth force we talked about, right? But in terms of threat of new entrants, high. Andy,
Yes.
yeah, help us out, man. Threat of new entrants. The PC.
Actually, not too high. Actually.
Not too high. Threat relatively medium to low.
Anyone can make their own PCs. They don't have that whole distribution network before, like IBM had or Compaq had. They have the funds for it also, but he started a very small business, started in his own room, and he eventually was able to duplicate the same things that big companies could do, and he was ahead of the game.
Oh, Michael Dell?
Yeah,
Oh, he was able to do those things?
yeah.
Wouldn't that make the threat high then?
No, because most of the threats come from manufacturers making mainframe computers. What Michael Dell was focusing on some more desktop computers. Everything is so even though they're both computers, the type of computer are completely different.
Okay. Well, we can't confuse now the mainframe and the PC now. It's a different industry. We don't put the mainframe and PC in the same industry. So if we were analyzing, if I were to say, what is the attractiveness of or the threat of new entry in the mainframe industry in the mid to late 1990s, that would be a totally different question than what is the attractiveness of the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s. It's a different industry, we would assume. And so we have to analyze industry by industry and can't lump together these industries. And that's one of the criticisms of Michael Porter's framework, is that industries, their lines are getting very blurred. And so sometimes it's very difficult to define an industry. And so sometimes this analysis doesn't work. And so we have to take that into consideration. And if we know those limitations, then our analysis will have some value. But if we don't know those limitations, then this can be very misleading as well. 정현. Yeah, don't worry. What do you think, 정현?
I think it's pretty high.
Threat of new entrants is high. Why?
Because anyone can come in as long as you have I mean, it's like all because of the way IBM made it kind of uniform for everybody. There's nothing really stopping people from doing what they like.
Yeah. I mean, you would think that in the computer industry, if you just ask somebody on the street, that have not read this case or doesn't know Michael Porter's 5 forces, and just ask, in the mid to late 1990s, do you think the threat of new entry in the PC industry is very high or low? And I would bet you, most of them say that the threat is very low, because they would say the entry barriers are very high, if you ask somebody on the street. But we know from reading this case and doing this analysis that it's the exact opposite. In the PC industry at that time, there are virtually no entry barriers. And what the hell is an entry barrier, And as everybody knows, entry barriers are things like money. How much money does it take to start or enter the business? In the PC industry, how much money does it take to enter the PC industry? Manon! How much money does it take to enter the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s? Very smart. Manon is smart. You know that. That's defined. I'm sorry, I can't read the English Korean name. Chaekyun?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Chaekyun. How much money does it take, man, to enter the PC industry? To make 250,000 PCs per year, how much does it cost?
I cannot imagine the exact amount of the money.
You can imagine it, man. It's on page 5. How much money, man? How much money? Somebody read the case. Thank you. Roughly $1 million, it says in the case. It's not from our head. We have no idea. These are the facts of the case. And I ask you, it says, if you want to enter the PC industry and start making 250,000 PCs per year, it costs roughly $1 million. 10억. Now. Victor, is $1 million a lot of money?
No.
What the hell are you talking about? What planet are you from? $1 million is a lot of money. If Hulk, 47 years old, for the next 20 years, I do the shouting lecture in the MBA program, will I make $1 million? Not the rate they're paying me. But $1 million for a company is not a lot. You know? So you're a corporation, and you want to enter the PC industry, and it takes $1 million to enter in the mid to late 1990s. That's nothing. You know? Another entry barrier that Mike Ford talks about is differentiation. If there's a lot of differentiation in industry, it's going to be tough to enter. Because you have to take away that brand identity, brand awareness, advertise, and all that. But in the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s, where's everybody named that? This is a conspiracy! So I want you to cold call you! I want, you know, your name to match so I can memorize some of these things, but, you know. He won! Yes, he won. In the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s, can you differentiate the PC? Why not? They all look the same?
There was not that much difference.
Hey, can you not differentiate the PC? IBM Plus?
I know. They were IBM clones.
Oh, they were IBM clones. So they all look the same. Let's say we make it different. You're right, they're IBM clones. Let's say I make a computer in the mid to late 1990s in the form of Hulk's face. Now, grant you, revenues would be very low. I got it. But this is a thought experiment. Just bear with me. If I made a PC in the mid-late 1990s that looks like my face, forgetting revenues and profits, would this not be differentiating the PC? Yes? This is the killer regarding this concept of differentiation. When you talk about differentiation, there is no limit. The limit on differentiation is you guys. Your limit on your imagination, that's the limit on differentiation. So when we talk about this factor of entry barriers in terms of differentiation, you can't talk about everything under the sun. What Michael Porter says in his research is differentiation is a really important entry barrier, but differentiation based on performance-enhancing characteristics or performance-defining characteristics. That's the word he uses. Performance-defining characteristics. You have to be able to differentiate your product and service in terms of performance-defining characteristics. What the hell is a performance-defining characteristics? The people in that industry, the consumers, the most demanding consumers, they have to find it the most important characters. That's the performance-defining characteristics. So in the mid to late 1990s, what is the performance-defining characteristic of the PC?
Speed.
Microprocessors. What else?
OS.
And there could be others, but in the mid to late 1990s, the performance-defining characteristics are microprocessors and operating systems. But the microprocessor and operating system, you cannot differentiate. Why?
It's domain.
Main supplier.
Because it's all monopolized. It's called the Wintel standard. And so if I'm a computer manufacturer in the early 1990s, I use Wintel. If I'm a new entrant, I'm going to use Wintel. Duh! And so we can't differentiate one another in terms of, yes, you can make a computer in the Hulk's face. Yes, you can make a computer that looks like an elephant. but this is not a performance-defining characteristic in terms of customer value. And so differentiation here, there's no differentiation because everybody uses with. And so, I mean, these are some of the entry barriers that Michael Porter talks about that sort of I summarized. You know, these things, initial capital outlay, very low, differentiation barriers, very low because it's standardized, switching costs are low, we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of buyers. It's very difficult to maintain cost advantages because, as the case states, a lot of the inputs are at fixed cost, so they don't have much leeway in terms of the cost dimension either. You know, there are entry barriers. I'm not saying it's zero. The one in red. If you enter the PC industry, you have to have access to distribution channels. You need that. You know, the Best Buys of the world right now, or you know, Highmark or whatever right now in Korea. You need that. So that's an entry barrier. And if you say there's no way I'm going to get access to entry barriers as a new entrant, then you would say the entry barriers are very high. You would probably say that. But if you say, yeah, I understand that we have to have access to distribution, but you know, overall, entry barriers are very low. And if that's your thought, your conclusion would be the threat of new entrants in this industry right now is moderate to very high in the mid to late 1990s because the entry barriers are very, very low. And that would be sort of one conclusion. The second of Michael Porter is the supplier. You know, and when you talk about suppliers, you know, sir, well, I don't know your name. What is your name? Juno. When we analyze the threat of suppliers, Juno, what is the first question we gotta ask? Sam, please help.
First question?
Yeah.
Supplier?
When we analyze the threat of suppliers, what's the first question we have to ask? Do they have a lot of power? Well, so when we analyze the threat of suppliers in terms of their power or not, what is the first question? Yes, Sam?
If they can replicate or take over.
No, not the first question. What is the first question? Huh? No, not how many suppliers. Yes, Sarah? Yeah, no.
What is the supply?
What are the suppliers? I mean, these other questions we have to ask after. But the first question we have to ask is, to know whether their power is high or not, you've got to know who the suppliers are, because the power of the suppliers will differ based on who the suppliers are, as you guys did in terms of your analysis. You know? So do we analyze every single supplier under the sun? No, you don't have time. Michael Porter's 5 Forces is not something you do for 1 month. You know, don't sleep, don't eat. You don't do that. You do this for like 30 minutes. Oh yeah. Get together. This is Michael Porter's 5 Forces. We know. In 30 minutes, you try to ascertain, in a broad sense, the attractiveness of the industry. You know? And in terms of the threat of suppliers, you've got to ask who are the suppliers. But when you do this, you try to analyze the most important or most relevant suppliers in the industry, as you can verify them. So in this industry, many suppliers, but who are the most relevant in this industry, in your opinion? It would be the performance-defining characteristic suppliers, which is Intel and Microsoft. And Intel and Microsoft. Sir, I don't know your name either. Yes, sir, yeah.
Yep.
Intel and Microsoft, suppliers. Do they have a lot of power?
Yep.
Why?
Well, because they're pretty much a monopoly in the market at that time.
They are pretty much a monopoly. So good, you know. It's not our class. I got a recruit. During lectures, professors also have to regroup. And so, man, it was great listening to these presentations today because, you know, just sitting down there is so comfortable. The chairs are so comfortable. And I'm listening and I'm writing down and I'm enjoying, you know, that it's good. Lecturing is not too good. And especially in these kinds of situations, I have to regroup. And so, in terms of the suppliers, the main suppliers are Intel and Microsoft, and they're practically not. They're then what does Michael Kors say? Suppliers' power is high. When there is one or very few suppliers, their power is high. When are suppliers high? When not only there's one or few suppliers and they dominate the market, but their product and service is really differentiated, then their power is much higher. And these firms, Microsoft, Intel, such a differentiated product. Chris would not use anything that's not Intel inside. And so especially in the mid to late 1990s, they have huge differentiation. And there's a lot of power. And then there are other suppliers in this industry that you guys talked about. And relatively speaking, these other suppliers don't have much power compared to Microsoft or Intel. You know? And so, in terms of, these are things in the case that everybody knows. And so the conclusion regarding this would be that the power of suppliers really high. Because Microsoft and Intel dominate, they supply the performance enhancing characteristics. And so because of those two giants, the power of suppliers is very high in this industry. Yes, Juan.
I know that they dominate the market in a number of suppliers, the significant suppliers is very low for the operating system and microprocessor.
Number of suppliers? Yes.
Suppliers are very low, and they had very high level of power. But the thing is, like, did they really take advantage of the power that they had in the past? Did they really take advantage? Because like in the article it says Intel made microprocessors available to all the major purchases at a standard price. So like from pricing perspective, they didn't really charge more than they could. So that's the reason why I thought that the rate of the suppliers was relatively
That
low.
statement or that statement?
Yeah, that for that.
Let me show you how powerful these guys were. You know, Alex asked the question about appropriability, which is so important, as we mentioned last class. A lot of times you're gonna do all the work, you're gonna do all the legwork, but then you only get 10% of the profits. But you did all the work. I mean, doesn't that happen in your group presentation? You know, you do all the work, yet everybody gets the same, reward. It's not fair. This is the question of appropriability. And in the PC industry, because Joan asked this question, let me go ahead. The PC manufacturers, they work all night long and all weekend long to make these profits. But you know who takes away that wealth? It's Microsoft and Intel. And I will show you through a picture. Let me show you the picture. It's called the profit pool. And this is developed by two Harvard professors, Gadiesh and then Gilbert. And Gadiesh, Ort Gadiesh, is now the CEO of Bain, I think. And then they developed the profit pool, and basically what this is very difficult to calculate. You need a lot of information and data. But this is the profit pool that they calculated for the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s. The x-axis is share of industry revenue. And these are the main players in the PC industry at that time. So you have players that have microprocessors and PC manufacturers, obviously, softwares, peripherals, services, and other components. These are the main players. And then this is the share of industry revenue. And if you look at this share of industry, what this means is who creates all the wealth. That's what it means. And if you look at it, who creates all the wealth? The PC manufacturers. They create all the wealth. But then the y-axis is the operating margins. This operating margin means who takes away the wealth. And if you look at who takes away the wealth, it's microprocessors, it's Intel and Microsoft. Because they have so much power as a supplier. As Chuan said, very little suppliers, very differentiated. They monopolize. And it says in the case that they act as, they encourage competition as well as a supplier. They make them fight. They say, IBM, I don't think you can beat up HP. HP, can you beat up IBM? And they make them fight. And then if you don't buy more Intels, next time when we come up with a new Intel, we're not going to give you as many. That's how they make them fight, because they have this huge power. And so Michael Porter says, in an industry, if all else is equal, of the five forces, the threat of rivalry is the most important factor. Because if rivalry is very high, chances are the industry will be very bad. Not always, but in the PC industry it's a little different. Yes, rivalry is a very important factor, but more important in the PC industry at that time is suppliers, because they have so much power at that time. And the PC manufacturers, they make all the money, but they take away all the wealth. This is the question of appropriability. You know? And so the question would be, if you're a PC manufacturer, why do you want to manufacture PCs? You make all the wealth, but you don't get any of the wealth. So why don't you go into an industry that takes away the wealth, which is appropriate? And these are questions that that folks have asked themselves. So in terms of the PC industry, the threat of suppliers is very, very high. In terms of the threat of buyers, same thing. When you analyze the threat of buyers, the same question: who are the buyers? Because there are many different kinds of buyers, and it depends on the industry how you define the buyers. Sometimes the buyers can be a country. If they buy nuclear reactors of GE, it can be a country. Many times the buyers are a company, or they're individual firms, or like us, end consumers. Many buyers. And so who are the buyers? And so who are the most relevant buyers? In terms of the PC, you guys, some do this in terms of transactional buyers or relational buyers and all that stuff, and that's fine, that's perfectly fine. But here, in terms of the PC, at this time in the era, we talk about two main buyers. Not to say there aren't any others, but these are two. The first main buyer is the end consumer, and that's us. And you can talk about companies as well. And the question is, as end consumers, do we have a lot of power in the PC industry? And the question is no. The question is yes, we have a lot of power. And then why? Because this is Michael Porter. He talks about a concept called switching costs. And as I introduced the last time, you remember, switching costs are one-time costs that we have to incur because we switch to a different supplier. And if we have a lot of switching costs, then we have no power, because we don't have much choice. But if we don't have any switching costs, I go to Hyundai department store today, but tomorrow my wife wants to go to Lotte department store, but I can go to Lotte without any cost, then I have a lot of power, because I can change my mind anytime. And in terms of the PC industry at this time, the consumers, their switching costs, do they have any switching costs? Is it high or low in terms of the end consumers? It's low. Raise your hands. Switching costs are low. That makes their power very high. Switching costs are high.
So is that maybe one reason why Apple customers are quote unquote more loyal, because the switching costs are higher, because the changing operating system from Windows to the OS is much different.
That's a good point. Alex, ask any strategy professor that analyzes these kinds of cases, especially computer. When we talk about Apple, we put them on a different planet. So Apple is not a PC manufacturer. You can't talk about that. This is going to screw up every analysis. And I'm not kidding. But he's right. Apple has so much differentiation, so many maniacs that only use Apple, and that has switching costs. That's the concept of switching costs. So once I use an Apple, and Compaq comes up with a new computer, I can't switch. I want to switch, but I can't switch because I love Apple so much. And that's why Apple has so much power. But in terms of the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s, switching costs are very low because they're all the same. Because they are all using Intel standards. And so they can switch anytime. I use a Compaq. HP comes up with a new computer, same. IBM, so I can switch anytime. And so the power is very high. And so, you can talk about the end consumer, many aspects of the end consumer. But one of them is the other consumer in terms of the buyers of this industry in the mid-late 1990s is the retailers. You know who real customers are? It's the retailers, the distributors, and resellers. They're a little bit all different, but in terms of the whole sort of distribution. And these are the main customers. And then again, Michael Porter says, customers' power is very high if I'm your customer right now, but if I change my mind tomorrow, I can integrate backwards. And if as a customer, I integrate backwards into your industry, I have that potential, then my power is that much higher. As opposed to, I'm a customer, but I will always be a customer. Then my power is not as high, you know. Anho, the distributors in the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s, can they integrate backwards into the PC industry and start manufacturing PCs? Anho?
Oh, they can, but
They can.
But I think they didn't want it.
They didn't want to, but they can. Okay. Hyungbong. You're just very unlucky to have your name tag today. Same question. Can the distributors of the PC industry in the mid to late 1990s integrate backwards into the PC industry, in your opinion? Yes. Why? Can the resellers, distributors at the time, can they integrate backwards into the PC industry? Can they?
Yes.
Why?
Low entrance.
Because there are no entry barriers. We just talked about that. When a distributor wants to enter, backwardly integrated enter, I'm sorry, this is irritating, I'm sorry. When they backwardly enter, it means they are a potential new entrant. Then, wow, what do we use to evaluate potential new entrants? We use entry barriers. And as we already substantiated, the entry barriers are very low. It takes $1 million to enter the PC industry. Differentiation is almost non-existent because of Wintel standards and all that. Yes, there is an entry barrier, you know. We need access to distribution channels, but these firms, these distributors, how do they overcome that? They are the distributor! I'm my own channel! And so CompUSA in the mid to late 1990s, they said, why do we always have to sell IBM PCs? Why don't we backwardly integrate? There's no entry barrier to enter. And then one says, Compaq executive says, hey, wait a second, we need some distribution. We are the distribution! So CompUSA in the 1990s, they sell computers made by CompUSA in CompUSA stores. How perfect is that? And so the retailers and distributors, they have so much power because they can integrate backwards into the PC industry anytime. And they actually did because the entry barriers are so low. The final one in terms of Michael Porter's 5 forces is the threat, fourth one is the threat of substitutes. And then again, as you mentioned, the substitutes in this era, not that high. But yes, there are, I think you guys identified them very well from the case. There are some, handheld organizers. I think this is PDA, workstations and network PCs, so they might be some substitutes. But, you say at that time, the technology is not too good for them to substitute the PC. This is the if I were to ask you in the year 2014, what is the threat of substitutes in the PC industry? Your reaction would be different than yours. You would say probably very high. Because now we have things like a tab, cloud computing, and all these things that you guys talked about. So Michael Porter, this is a way to predict the future as well. You don't have to use this right now for your own situation. You can use it to look into the future and say, right now the substitutes are very low because of technology, but in 2 or 3 years, because technology, innovation growing so high, and that in 3 years, the substitutes are going to be very high. And you can use it to predict the future and but at that time, the threat of substitutes, I would guess, is relatively low. Yes, Rasmus?
in the situation, or in this specific industry, when we talk about substitutes, is it hard to determine? Because if you have a tablet, for instance, you're still dependent on apps. You're still dependent on Microsoft providing Microsoft Word for your iPhone, for your web. So is there a specific term for this, or is it just because the electronics and the computer industry is so, it's developed so massively the last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, so that's Michael Porter's, as you do this analysis, you have to first define the industry. And then as you define the industry, you have to talk about what are some potential substitutes for this industry. And then if you evaluate the PC industry, I would not put, most people would not put the tag into the PC industry. They would see it's related, but they would not see it as the same industry. But some people might say, well, tab and PC are the same, and if you want to lump it in, but the analysis and conclusion would be different, I would suspect. And so you've got to be very careful using this analysis. You've got to know how you define the industry and what were the assumptions you made as you did this analysis. If we know that, then we would know in terms of the conclusion. We would look at the conclusion in light of your assumptions and your definition. But if we don't know that, then this could be very misleading. And so in terms of the PC, this is, if we analyze and say it's the PC industry, then we would think about what are things that can be a substitute for the PC. And then Michael Porter defines substitute as something that satisfies consumer needs and wants, but in a different way. This is also very confusing. So from Hoke's perspective, I would say a substitute, just think of a substitute as something that wants to kill me. So if there are many things that can kill my product or service, that would be a substitute in my opinion. Michael Porter wouldn't define it that way. He would say, something that satisfies consumer needs and wants in a different way. But that's, in itself, is very confusing. So from my perspective, I would just say a substitute is something that wants to kill you. I have this strange experience that past 15 years I've been lecturing. When I say Michael Porter says, everybody starts writing down. And then I say sometimes, in my opinion, they stop writing. And some students throw away the pen. I'm thinking, what the hell's going on? So sometimes I have some thoughts too, a little bit. Not much, but some of my own thinking. But then when I say it's my thoughts, no one writes it down. So sometimes I have to take you out and say, according to Michael Porter, or according to Campbell. So, what would be something, I mean, if I were to ask you what's a substitute for Korean professional baseball, which started, yesterday. What is a substitute for Korean baseball? What would you say? Raise your hand, somebody. Yes, Christopher.
Major League Baseball?
It could be Major League Baseball. It could be Ryu Yeon-jin. It could be Choo Choo Train, And what else, So a lot of Koreans are watching Major League Baseball now. Before they would not watch as much. But now, every time Ryu Yeon-jin, Saturday, 5:10 in the morning, this Saturday, mark it down, 5:10. Dodger Stadium, Ryu Yeon-jin is going to pitch. We know that. And so Major League Baseball is a substitute for Korean baseball. Well, what's another substitute?
Every other sport.
It could be every other sport, sure.
Messi.
It could be Avengers. Avengers 2. This is a substitute for baseball. It's CGV. So this one. I have Manwon, and I asked my wife, honey, we have Manwon. Where should we spend our day today with this Manwon? Should we go to the SK, or Tucson Bears baseball, or should we go and watch Captain America? Great movie, by the way, Captain America. Winter Soldier. It is a new movie. You gotta see it. And it's a substitute. And so, Major Korean baseball, the owners, this is what they're saying. You know what's going to kill us? If I'm Samsung Lions, Tucson Bears is not going to kill me. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about CGV. I'm worried about Universal Studios. I'm worried about Major League Baseball. I'm worried about Messi. You know, because these are all things that can come and kill you. These are substitutes. And so the question before you in terms of the PC industry, in the mid to late 1990s, are there many things that can come and kill the PC? And now, are there many things that can come and kill the PC? And if you say yes, the threat of substitutes is very high, would make it very, very unattractive. If you say no, then it's a good industry. And that's what my opinion is. The final one is in terms of threat of rivalry. And again, competition, rivalry, this is the killer. And according to Michael Porter's analysis, as both groups stated, the threat of rivalry in this industry is very high. And then these are some of the factors that Michael Porter talks about in terms of rivalry. And one of the things is the differentiation. So product differentiation can be an entry barrier. It's a factor that talks about rivalry. Switching costs can be a factor in here, in here, and here, and so on. What Michael Porter talks about is when there's a lot of differentiation, we don't have to fight as much. So if all computer manufacturers are very different, they have their unique thing, their story, then they don't have to fight as much. But when all firms in an industry, they start looking the same, no product differentiation, then they're going to start really fighting it out, especially in terms of price wars. Because the only dimension that they can fight is on price, if they all look the same. And as we know from the PC industry, differentiation is very, very low. And so they start fighting it out between the price wars. Yvonne?
At that time, the market was still growing, right? So
that's the second one. Michael Porter says, of all the factors that indicates rivalry, all else equal, the biggest one is industry growth. If industry growth is really growing, then you don't have to fight as much. And this is good for you. It's an attractive industry. So because you don't have to come to work on weekends. But when industry growth starts to stale and plateau, then that's when you have to really start fighting because you have to take away market share from your competitors. And the PC industry, as we calculate the growth rate, the guys use a lot of things, right? Especially the CAGR, cumulative average growth rate. When you calculate this for the PC industry, you're right. The PC industry is growing, but it's growing. The growth rate is slowing down. So the word we use is it's growing at increasing at a decreasing rate. So you get what I'm saying. So rivalry is increasing. So and then this is another one. Michael Porter talks about exit barriers. You know entry barriers, but there's something called an exit barrier. An exit barrier is this: when firms in an industry they want to exit the industry, I don't want to do this anymore for whatever reason. And if they can exit the industry any time, then rivalry is relatively low. But if firms cannot exit, they want to get the hell out of here, but they can't. Why? Because we have too much invested, sunk cost. Why? Because all the values of our managers is in this business. We're going to either die or live in this business. No other business, for example. Then they have high exit barriers. And that means they're going to draw a line in the sand and say, we're going to fight till we die. And that increases rivalry. And so an indication of exit barriers here, there could be many.